Hi there. If you're here, you're probably looking for two things: a little history and a lot of sleep. So lie back, get comfortable, maybe dim the lights, maybe fluff your pillow like it owes you money. Wrap yourself in that warm blanket of yours and take a deep breath. You made it through the day, and now you deserve a little rest. Tonight, I'm going to take you somewhere old, very old, a time long before Wi-Fi, soy lattes, or the luxury of complaining about traffic. We're headed back to the Roman Empire. You've seen the movies. Maybe you even played a game or two. In your mind, it's probably all marble columns, flowing togas, and dramatic speeches in front of cheering crowds. But let's just say the real thing was more goats, more grime, and a lot more gladiators with questionable dental hygiene. So, as your eyelids get heavier, let's gently stroll back into history, back to a world where sandals were high fashion and clean water was more valuable than gold. Ready? All right then, let's begin. Chapter 1. Rome, the eternal city, land of Caesars, poets, philosophers, and public toilets with no doors, the majestic capital of an empire that stretched from the foggy moors of Britannia to the scorching sands of Egypt, from the wild forests of Germania to the sun-baked shores of North Africa, a civilization that gave us roads that still stand today, aqueducts that defied gravity, and legal concepts we still use in modern courtrooms, the birthplace of legendary generals who conquered continents, orators whose words echo through millennia, and engineers whose innovations would not be matched for 1,000 years after their empire crumbled into dust. When we think about the Roman Empire, our minds tend to wander through polished marble halls, echoing with the voices of wise senators and scheming emperors. We imagine opulent banquet halls where silver goblets overflow with sweet wine from vineyards across the Mediterranean. Perhaps you picture a nobleman reclining gracefully on a couch, his slaves creating gentle breezes with peacock feather fans, while being hand-fed grapes plucked from the finest vines in all of Italy. Maybe you envision a dignified patrician woman draped in flowing silks, imported from the distant east, adorned with gold and precious gems, while a elegant lyre plays softly in the background, and poets recite verses celebrating the glory of Rome. A toga draped just so across a bronzed shoulder, the embodiment of classical dignity. The smell of olive oil and fresh bread in the air mingles with exotic spices from Persia and India. Incense burns in ornate bronze holders, honoring household gods that watch over families with divine protection. It all sounds so civilized, so refined, so utterly sophisticated compared to the so-called Dark Ages that would follow. A beacon of culture in a world of barbarians, the pinnacle of human achievement before electricity, before computers, before modern medicine. But let's pump the brakes on the chariot for just a moment. Let's pull back the silk curtains and take a peek behind those impressive marble facades. Let's look past the grandeur of the Colosseum and the majesty of the Pantheon. Let's scratch beneath the surface of those romantic notions about togas and philosophy and epic poetry, because while ancient Rome was undoubtedly a marvel of engineering, governance, and culture, it was also, how should I put this gently, absolutely disgusting, revoltingly, stomach-churningly, nose-pinchingly foul, in ways that would make even the most hardened modern traveler retch in horror. A cesspool of human waste, rotting food, disease, and casual violence that would make our sanitized, deodorized, antibacterial, modern sensibilities collapse faster than a poorly constructed insula during an earthquake. And if you, dear modern listener, were suddenly transported back to the height of Roman civilization, whisked away from your climate-controlled home, your flush toilets, your refrigeration, your antibiotics, and your basic understanding of germs, you wouldn't last a day, not a single solitary day. In fact, I'd put good money on you running screaming before lunchtime, begging whatever gods or time travel mechanism brought you there to return you to the blessed comfort of the 21st century. Let's start with the basics. You know, the stuff you need to survive. Food, water, shelter, and a place to go when nature calls. Simple things, right? The fundamental necessities that every human being requires, regardless of time period or geography. The bare minimum for comfort and survival. Not quite. Water, for instance. Yes, the Romans were brilliant engineers. They built aqueducts that brought water into cities from miles away, arching gracefully across valleys and boring through hillsides. Mighty constructions of precisely cut stone that carried millions of gallons of fresh water every day from mountain springs to thirsty urban centers. Genius, revolutionary, absolutely groundbreaking for its time. A feat of engineering so impressive that some Roman aqueducts still stand today, 2 millennia after their construction, silently testifying to Roman ingenuity. Except that water didn't always end up where you wanted it to, and sometimes it ended up exactly where you didn't want it to. Those magnificent aqueducts might have brought water into the city, but once it arrived, the distribution system was less than ideal. The concept of clean water as a universal right was as foreign to the Romans as smartphones or nuclear physics. See, public fountains were common throughout Roman cities. Water burbled out of elegantly carved spouts, splashing into basins where citizens could fill their clay jugs and amphorae. But clean water wasn't guaranteed, not by a long shot. Your average Roman might draw water from the same fountain a horse just sneezed into, or where a butcher had just rinsed off his blood-covered hands, or worse, one that downstream shared plumbing with the local latrina. The public toilet, the concept of water treatment, was non-existent. No chlorine, no filtering systems, no quality control whatsoever. You simply took what came out of the pipe and hoped for the best. Sometimes that meant drinking water laced with lead from the pipes themselves, slowly poisoning yourself with every supposedly refreshing gulp. And oh, the toilets, the infamous Roman latrinae, perhaps the most visceral example of how different daily life was in ancient times compared to our modern expectations. If you're imagining some private porcelain sanctuary, a peaceful room where you can tend to your biological necessities in blessed solitude, stop right there. Banish that thought entirely from your mind. Your modern bathroom, with its locking door, scented candles, and stack of magazines, is a luxury beyond the comprehension of even the wealthiest Roman citizen. Roman toilets were communal, not just communal in the sense of shared by a family or even shared by the residents of an apartment building. No, these were public in the fullest sense of the word. Imagine a long stone bench with strategically placed holes, no dividers, no privacy screens, no individual stalls, just a row of openings where citizens of all classes would sit, elbow to elbow, to relieve themselves. Everyone sat together, chatted, did their business. The Romans considered defecation a social activity, not a private embarrassment. Business deals were made, gossip was exchanged, and friendships were deepened while you and your fellow citizens emptied your bowels in full view of one another. There was even a shared sponge on a stick for cleaning up afterward. Yes, shared, as in used by multiple people, one after another, all day long. They called it a tersorium, and no, they didn't sterilize it between uses. They might give it a cursory rinse in a channel of running water, the same water that might be connected to your drinking supply further downstream. Think about that the next time you complain about cheap toilet paper or an empty dispenser in a public restroom. At least you're not sharing your wiping implements with half the neighborhood, including that guy with the suspicious rash and the merchant who just returned from trading in distant lands with their exotic diseases. Now let's talk shelter. Where did the average Roman rest their weary head after a long day of surviving in this chaotic urban environment? If you were wealthy, sure, you might have a spacious villa with mosaic floors, a courtyard with a bubbling fountain, flowering plants imported from across the Mediterranean, perhaps even your own private bath. Your home might boast rooms dedicated to specific purposes, dining rooms, bedrooms, studies, reception halls for entertaining guests. Slaves would tend to your every need, keeping your quarters clean and preparing elaborate meals in kitchen spaces safely tucked away from the main living areas. But most Romans, they lived in cramped, multi-story apartment buildings called insulae. Think of them as ancient Roman fire hazards stacked one on top of the other. These structures rose 5, 6, sometimes even 7 stories high. The higher floors were cheaper, and for good reason. Without elevators or any mechanical means of lifting water, those who lived on upper floors had to carry every drop they used up countless stairs. And in case of fire, which was frequent, they'd be the last to learn of the danger and face the greatest challenge in escaping. The walls were thin, often just wood and plaster, allowing you to hear every argument, every passionate encounter, and every crying baby from the units surrounding yours. The plumbing was questionable, with waste sometimes simply tossed out windows onto the streets below. The famous Roman sewers, they served the public spaces and the homes of the wealthy, not your average cramped apartment building. The stairs were steep, narrow, and often poorly lit, becoming death traps during emergencies. And fires, oh, fires were frequent. Oil lamps tipped over, cooking fires spread. Braziers used for heating spilled their coals, because nothing says good night like hoping your neighbor's oil lamp doesn't tip over while he's half asleep, potentially consigning you and everyone in your building to a fiery death while you slumber. And then there's the smell, the omnipresent, inescapable aroma of ancient urban life that would assault your modern nostrils with shocking ferocity. Rome stank. It's hard to say this nicely. It's impossible to overstate this point. The city reeked with an odor so powerful it would make your eyes water, your stomach heave, and your head spin. There were open sewers running alongside streets, their contents sometimes overflowing during heavy rains. Trash heaps accumulated wherever people could find a space to dump their refuse, with no regular collection services to speak of. Animal droppings from horses, mules, and oxen littered the streets, ground to a slippery paste under countless sandals. Human droppings from those who couldn't make it to a latrina or simply didn't bother. Fish markets, where the day's catch sat unrefrigerated in the Mediterranean sun. Unwashed bodies, because while the Romans did bathe, many couldn't afford to do so daily. The occasional decomposing something or other, perhaps an animal that died in an alley, perhaps something more sinister, left where it fell until the smell became too much even for Roman sensibilities. You couldn't just plug in a lavender-scented diffuser and call it a day. You couldn't spray some Febreze and solve the problem. The stench was environmental, pervasive, inescapable. Let's not forget food, the culinary traditions of ancient Rome, which have been so romanticized by historians and food writers, eager to connect our modern palates to the ancient world. Yes, Roman cuisine gets a lot of praise, and it could be delicious if you were rich. If you were among the patrician class, you might enjoy exotic flavors, imported spices, and the talents of skilled cooks creating multi-plate meals featuring flamingo tongues, dormice cooked in honey, and elaborate vegetable dishes seasoned with herbs from your garden. Your dining room might feature couches for reclining, while servants brought course after course, with entertainment between services. If not, get ready for a lot of porridge. Pulse was the staple food of the common Roman, consumed at virtually every meal by the vast majority of the population. Imagine a bland, gluey mix of grains and water, cooked slowly over a fire in a communal pot. No sugar, no cinnamon, no berries on top, no maple syrup or brown sugar to make it palatable. Just gray and filling and monotonous, day after day after day. If you were lucky, perhaps you'd have a bit of cheese to crumble into it, or a drizzle of olive oil to add some fat and flavor. If you were unlucky, you'd discover weevils had gotten into your grain stores, adding unexpected protein to your meal, whether you wanted it or not. And meat, rare and expensive. The average Roman might enjoy meat only during festivals or special occasions. Butchery was conducted in public, with no refrigeration, meaning the meat sold in markets was often on the verge of spoilage. Fish, sometimes, but it was usually salted beyond recognition to preserve it, bearing little resemblance to the fresh seafood we prize today. Vegetables, often overcooked and underflavored, grown in soil fertilized with human waste, increasing the risk of foodborne illness. The seasoning of choice, garum, a fermented fish sauce that smelled like low tide on a hot day. Romans put it on everything. Think of it as their ketchup. If ketchup were made from anchovy ghosts, left to rot in the sun for months, the powerful smell of garum production facilities was so notorious that there were actually laws dictating how far from residential areas these facilities had to be located. So, you've eaten your breakfast of lukewarm mush and fish goo. Time to get dressed for your day. Your clothes? Probably itchy, made from wool or linen, depending on the season and your budget. No cotton blends, no synthetic fabrics engineered for comfort and ease of movement, no elastic waistbands, no breathable athleisure, no moisture-wicking performance wear, just heavy, scratchy natural fibers that required extensive labor to produce. And in summer, it was sweltering. The Mediterranean climate could be brutally hot, with temperatures soaring under the relentless sun. Toga, sure, if you're a citizen with the right to wear one, but wrapping yourself in a giant woolen sheet in 30-degree C heat isn't exactly a dream come true. It was less fashion statement and more slow roast, leaving you soaked with sweat and chafed raw in places you'd rather not discuss in polite company. Still think you'd thrive in the Roman Empire? Still fantasizing about walking those ancient streets, participating in philosophical debates in the Forum, watching chariot races in the Circus Maximus? Let's talk hygiene, personal cleanliness. In a world before deodorant, before toothpaste, before shampoo, Romans bathed regularly, it's true. This is one area where they might actually surpass many periods that followed them. Public bathhouses were everywhere in Roman cities, from elaborate complexes with multiple pools of varying temperatures to simple neighborhood establishments offering basic services. But hygiene wasn't quite what we'd call hygienic. You bathed with strangers in reused water that grew increasingly murky as the day progressed. You oiled your skin, then scraped the dirt off with a tool called a strigil, essentially a curved metal implement used to physically remove grime, oil, and dead skin. No soap as we know it today, just oil and scraping. The strigil would leave your skin red and sometimes raw, but nominally clean by Roman standards. And the bathhouses weren't just for bathing, they were social hubs. You'd gossip, exercise, conduct business, gamble. Some offered libraries, lecture halls, or gardens. Think of them as gyms meet spas meet Starbucks. But with more nudity and body odor, they were microcosms of Roman society where classes mingled. Though the wealthiest might have their own private facilities or preferred hours, ideas were exchanged and the daily news circulated along with various contagious conditions. Illness, a constant threat looming over every Roman, from the lowliest slave to the emperor himself. The germ theory of disease wouldn't arrive for another 800 years. People thought bad air, miasma, caused sickness, or perhaps divine displeasure, or an imbalance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Doctors might prescribe crushed mouse brains for epilepsy, or advise bloodletting for almost anything from fever to indigestion to melancholy. Fun, wounds easily became infected in a world without antibiotics or even a basic understanding of sterile technique. A simple cut could lead to death if infection set in. Childbirth was incredibly dangerous for both mother and infant. Plagues swept through cities with terrifying regularity, sometimes killing significant percentages of the population in a single outbreak. And let's not forget the bugs, the unwelcome roommates who shared your living space, whether you liked it or not. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs were your constant companions. You'd go to sleep itchy and wake up itchier, your skin marked with bites and rashes that would never fully heal because you'd be bitten again the next night. No mosquito spray, no bug zappers, no exterminators to call, no sealed windows with screens to keep out disease-carrying insects, just you and a tiny buzzing army that feasted on your blood and potentially transmitted diseases as they moved from person to person. At this point, you might be thinking, okay, but what about the glory, the culture, the art? Surely that makes up for the physical discomfort and health risks. The majesty of the Colosseum, the brilliance of Virgil's poetry, the wisdom of Seneca and Marcus Aurelius. Don't these achievements compensate for the more unpleasant aspects of daily life? Absolutely. Rome was home to incredible thinkers, builders, and writers. The philosophical and artistic accomplishments of the Romans continue to influence our world today. But unless you were rich, educated, and male, you probably didn't benefit from much of it. The average Roman couldn't read the works of the great poets. They might glimpse the magnificent temples and public buildings, but they weren't the ones commissioning art or attending elite symposia where ideas were exchanged. Culture was created largely by and for the upper classes, with the masses receiving whatever trickled down, primarily in the form of public spectacles designed to keep them docile and loyal to the state. Women had few rights. They were under the legal control of their fathers until marriage, then their husbands. They couldn't vote, couldn't hold political office, and had limited property rights. There were exceptions and complexities to these rules, particularly for wealthy widows or women from powerful families. But by and large, half the population lived with significant legal and social restrictions. Enslaved people had none. Slavery wasn't based on race, as in more recent historical periods, but rather on conquest, birth, or economic necessity. Anyone could become a slave if captured in war or born to an enslaved mother. Some slaves were highly educated and held positions of responsibility as teachers, accountants, or household managers. Others endured brutal conditions in mines, quarries, or agricultural estates, working literally to death under the Mediterranean sun. All were property, subject to the will of their owners, with no legal rights to protect them from abuse. And entertainment? Well, gladiator fights, executions turned into public spectacles, animal hunts, where exotic beasts from across the empire were slaughtered by the hundreds, all part of a day at the arena. People cheered as humans were mauled or stabbed, as criminals were executed in elaborately staged theatrical deaths, recreating myths or historical events. Blood sport wasn't a fringe activity. It was mainstream entertainment, sponsored by the state, attended by citizens of all classes, including women and children. not quite your Sunday Netflix binge, unless you're into the really dark stuff that would get a streaming service immediately shut down and its executives arrested. So next time someone says, "I was born in the wrong era," and starts waxing poetic about the glories of ancient Rome, maybe remind them that modern plumbing, antibiotics, and coffee shops are actually pretty great. That democracy, however flawed, offers protections and possibilities that would amaze the average Roman citizen. That our understanding of disease, hygiene, and human rights, while still evolving, has progressed rather dramatically in 2,000 years. In the Roman Empire, your idea of a good time might be not dying before age 30. Your greatest achievement might be surviving childbirth or avoiding infection after a minor injury. Your daily victories would be finding clean water, avoiding food poisoning, and not being crushed by a collapsing apartment building or caught in one of the frequent urban fires. Still, despite the discomfort, the empire endured for centuries, and its legacy continues to shape the world we live in. Our languages, our laws, our notions of government and citizenship all bear the imprint of Rome. We still marvel at their architectural achievements, study their literature, and ponder their philosophical insights. There is much to admire in what they built, even while acknowledging the very real hardships faced by those who lived during this period. But before we get into all that, let's take a walk through an ordinary day in this extraordinary time. Let's follow a typical Roman through the hours from dawn to dusk, experiencing the rhythm of life in the ancient world. Perhaps this journey will help us appreciate both how far we've come and what fundamental human experiences remain unchanged across the millennia. Chapter 2. You wake up to the sound of a rooster, not your smartphone alarm, not some calming waterfall ringtone, not even an old-fashioned mechanical clock ticking gently beside your bed. An actual rooster, its shrill call piercing the early morning air with biological precision. And not just one rooster announcing the dawn with solitary pride. It's a chorus of them, scattered throughout the neighborhood, each seemingly trying to outdo the others in volume and persistence. The sound bounces off stone walls and filters through your shutterless window, impossible to silence or snooze through for another 5 minutes of precious sleep. Somewhere nearby, a goat bleats with surprising volume for an animal its size, probably kept in a small courtyard for milk and eventually meat. A donkey brays, the sound like rusty hinges amplified tenfold. Someone yells in Latin, perhaps at the animal, perhaps at a recalcitrant child or slave. Speaking of children, one starts crying, a universal sound that transcends time and language, the unmistakable wail of a human too young to articulate its needs in any other way. Dogs bark in response to all this commotion, adding their voices to the urban symphony that serves as your daily wake-up call. You're definitely not alone in this densely packed city where privacy is a concept as foreign as electricity or indoor plumbing. Welcome to your life in the Roman Empire, not as a visiting tourist who can retreat to a modern hotel after a day of sightseeing, not as a temporary observer who can return to the comfort of the 21st century when the novelty wears off, but as a resident, a citizen, or perhaps a freedman, someone fully immersed in this world with all its wonders and discomforts. Let's say it's around the year 120 CE. The empire is at its territorial peak under Emperor Hadrian. Pax Romana, the Roman peace, blankets the Mediterranean world, suppressing major conflicts and allowing trade and culture to flourish across 3 continents. Construction has begun on Hadrian's Wall in distant Britannia, marking the northwestern frontier of Roman civilization. The Pantheon, with its revolutionary concrete dome, has recently been completed in Rome, standing as a testament to engineering prowess and religious devotion. You live in a city, maybe not Rome itself, with its million-plus inhabitants, but one of the many bustling Roman towns scattered across the empire. It could be Ostia, the port city serving the capital, or Antioch in the east, where cultures blend and trade routes converge, or even Londinium, on the foggy edge of the known world. It doesn't matter much. While local customs and climate might vary, the fundamentals of Roman urban life remain consistent throughout the empire, standardized by architectural practices, administrative systems, and cultural expectations that spread wherever the legions marched. The details change, but the discomfort remains consistent. Your home is a tiny apartment on the 3rd floor of an insula, a single room, perhaps 15 feet square, if you're lucky, serving as your entire living space. This is where you cook, eat, sleep, and entertain the rare visitor brave enough to climb the precarious stairs to reach you. The ceiling sags a little where water damage from the apartment above has weakened the structure. The walls are cracked, showing the lath beneath the plaster in places, evidence of the building settling, or perhaps damage from one of the minor earthquakes that occasionally shake the city. Your neighbor upstairs had a bit too much wine last night and is now stomping around like he's auditioning for a gladiator show, each footfall sending dust filtering down from your ceiling and making the oil lamp hanging from a hook sway ominously. Your bed? A straw mattress. And I use the word mattress generously. It's more a lumpy, uneven sack of hay or straw, or whatever plant material was cheapest when you last needed to refill it. The stuffing has been compressed by countless nights of sleep, forming valleys and ridges that poke uncomfortably into your back. It's been slept on too many times, and by too many people. Perhaps you share it with a spouse, children, or other family members, depending on your living situation. There's a musty smell you've learned to ignore, mostly a smell composed of human sweat, mildew from humidity, and the gradually decomposing organic material that serves as your mattress filling. No memory foam here, no supportive springs, not even a proper bed frame to keep you elevated from the drafts and pests at floor level. There's no mirror in your apartment, but you know what you look like after a night on that excuse for a bed. Unkempt hair sticking up at odd angles or flattened on one side, maybe some soot smudged across your cheek from the oil lamp that burned low as you slept, and eyes that definitely didn't get a full 8 hours of rest, because every sound in this densely packed building penetrated your consciousness throughout the night. You pull on your tunic, which you slept in because it's the only one you own, and because changing into pajamas wasn't a thing in Roman times. And laundry day, well, it's more like laundry season. You might wash your garment occasionally by bringing it to the Fulanica, the commercial laundry where workers stomp on clothes in vats of stale urine whose ammonia content helps remove stains, but it's not a regular occurrence. You step into your sandals, hard leather soles with straps that cross over your foot, designed for function rather than comfort, with no arch support, no cushioning, no ergonomic considerations whatsoever. You're lucky if both straps still work properly and haven't begun to detach from the sole after months of daily wear on rough stone streets. The floor is cold and gritty beneath your feet, accumulated dirt from the street having been tracked in and never fully swept out of the cracks between floorboards or tiles. You mentally prepare for your morning routine, such as it is. To relieve yourself, you have two options: a chamber pot in the corner of your room or the public latrina down the street. The chamber pot is convenient but creates immediate odor issues in your small living space, and eventually you'll have to carry it downstairs and empty it somewhere, possibly just out the window if you're particularly inconsiderate or in a hurry. A practice common enough that pedestrians learned to walk close to buildings at their peril. You choose the public option today because it's good to stretch your legs and connect with the neighborhood as it comes to life. And maybe you don't want to clean out a pot today, scraping residue from its sides and dealing with the inevitable splashes that occur during disposal. You descend the narrow stairs, ducking in places where the ceiling slopes precariously low, steadying yourself against walls worn smooth by countless hands before yours. The stairwell is dark, even during daylight hours, with no windows to illuminate your path. You rely on muscle memory and the faint glow filtering up from the street-level entrance to guide your steps. The streets are already buzzing with activity despite the early hour. Vendors are setting up stalls along the thoroughfare, arranging wares brought in overnight from farms surrounding the city. A man shouts about his fresh fish, caught sometime last week, judging by the smell that reaches you from several stalls away. The fish lie on the stone slabs, their eyes cloudy, flies beginning to gather despite the vendor's constant waving. Children run barefoot through the streets, playing games with stones and fragments of pottery, dodging between pedestrians and the occasional cart with practiced agility. A pair of soldiers stroll past, their armor clinking with each step, javelins resting casually on their shoulders. They glare at everyone like they're bored and would love an excuse to hit someone. The universal expression of low-ranking enforcers throughout history. You reach the latrina. It's exactly what you expect. A stone bench perforated with roughly circular holes, extending along 3 walls of a small room. No dividers, no privacy screens, nothing but open space between you and your fellow citizens, attending to nature's call. A few strangers are already seated, nodding good morning like you're all in line for coffee instead of, well, the conversation continues uninterrupted as you take your place, discussing politics, local gossip, the price of grain, or upcoming festivals. You grab the communal sponge stick, the tersorium, from the bucket of vinegar water where it loosely sanitizes between uses. Try not to think about where it's been and who used it last, and get on with your necessary business as water flows continuously through a channel beneath the bench, carrying waste toward the main sewer line. Back at your apartment, breakfast is simple. Pulse, again, that same beige porridge made of emmer wheat boiled with water into a thick, starchy mass that forms the backbone of the Roman commoner's diet. You scrape off the crust from the pot you left on the hearth last night, perhaps rekindling a small fire if you want it warm, more likely eating it cold to save precious fuel. No sugar to sweeten it, no milk to make it creamy, no fruit to add color and flavor, just a hot, mushy start to your mushy day. Sustenance rather than culinary pleasure. If you're lucky, there's a scrap of bread left from yesterday, now slightly stale, but still edible, with its dense crumb and hard crust, suitable for dipping into a bit of olive oil if you can afford it. Maybe some olives, their bitter flavors muted by the brining process that preserves them through seasons. You find a fig that's only slightly squishy, a small luxury tucked away yesterday from a passing street vendor who sold them at prices that only allow for occasional indulgence. That's the highlight of your meal, the touch of sweetness, a welcome break from the bland monotony of everyday fare. You eat quickly, standing by the small window to catch the early light. There's no dining table in your cramped apartment, just a stool and a bit of floor space near the wall where you sometimes place your food when you want to pretend at civility. You check the time, not with a watch strapped to your wrist or a clock on your wall. You don't own a sundial. Those are for public spaces and the homes of the wealthy. You just know from the shadows slanting across buildings and the sounds of the street below, the rhythm of the city as familiar to you as your own heartbeat. It's time to get to work, to join the economic machinery that keeps the empire functioning through the labor of countless anonymous hands. What do you do in this ancient economy? What role do you play in the vast, complex web of goods and services that sustains urban life? Maybe you're a laborer, hauling bricks for yet another bathhouse, commissioned by a wealthy patron, seeking to ensure his legacy through public works. Your back already aches at the thought of the day ahead, lifting and carrying from dawn until dusk, your skin burning under the Mediterranean sun. Despite your tan, your hands calloused, but still splitting open occasionally under the rough materials you handle daily, or a weaver working in a cramped room full of itchy fabric, your fingers nimble but permanently stained from dyes, your lungs filled with fabric dust, your eyes strained from focusing on detailed work in insufficient light filtering through small windows designed more to maintain structural integrity of buildings than to illuminate workspaces. Or you run errands for the local merchant, dodging carts and dodgier customers, carrying messages and small packages through the labyrinthine streets you know like the back of your hand, earning barely enough to feed yourself, but storing away knowledge of the city's commercial networks that might someday allow you to establish your own business if fortune smiles upon you. Maybe you're a clerk, copying scrolls until your hand cramps, transcribing business records or legal documents, or perhaps, if you're fortunate, philosophical texts or poetry that transport your mind even as your body remains hunched over a wax tablet or sheet of papyrus, your eyes burning from the effort of forming tiny, precise letters for hours on end. No matter your job, it's exhausting, physically demanding, in ways that modern workers can scarcely imagine, without ergonomic considerations or labor laws, or concern for repetitive stress injuries, without coffee breaks or lunch hours protected by contract, without workplace safety standards or compensation for injuries sustained while performing your duties. There's no break room with comfortable chairs and a refrigerator for your packed lunch. No ergonomic chair designed to support your spine through long hours of seated work. Just sun, sweat, and the constant threat of stepping in something unpleasant deposited in the street by humans or animals with no regard for where they leave their waste. Midday comes. It's hot, unreasonably hot, the kind of heat that makes your tunic cling to you in unfortunate places, sweat trickling down your back and between your shoulder blades, salt crystals forming at your hairline as moisture evaporates from your skin faster than it can drip. There's no air conditioning, no fan stirring the stagnant air, not even ice to cool your drink or press against your forehead for momentary relief. Maybe a breeze, if you're lucky, a whisper of moving air that offers brief respite before disappearing again. And only if your building wasn't constructed to trap heat like an oven, brick, and stone, absorbing the sun's energy all day and radiating it back at night when you're trying to sleep. You pause for a quick lunch, more bread, perhaps brought with you from home wrapped in a scrap of cloth, or purchased from a street vendor who sells slices from a large round loaf carried in a basket on his head. Maybe some beans, seasoned with a bit of garum for flavor, served in a clay bowl you bring back day after day to the same food stall where the proprietor knows your preferences without asking. You drink some water from a nearby fountain, cupping your hands beneath the flow, trying not to think about what else might be in that water as it travels through the city's complex network of pipes and cisterns. The afternoon stretches on interminably. Your muscles ache from the morning's labor, protesting each additional task you assign them. Your stomach grumbles, never quite satisfied by the simple fare that makes up your diet. You stub your toe on an uneven paving stone. Twice, the sun begins to lower in the sky, casting longer shadows between buildings. And finally, you can head home, joining the crowd of similarly exhausted workers, making their way through streets that grow quieter as businesses close for the day. Dinner, more of the same. Porridge, if you're too tired to prepare anything else. Bread purchased on the way home, if you remembered. Maybe some lentils cooked with onions and a dash of olive oil, if you're feeling particularly ambitious after your exhausting day. If you have friends over, rare in your small living quarters, but not unheard of on special occasions or religious festivals, you might share a bit of wine. It's sour, by modern standards, probably diluted with water, as was the Roman custom. Cut with herbs or honey if you can afford such luxuries, but it gets the job done, loosening tongues and easing the aches of the day, bringing a moment of conviviality to lives that are predominantly focused on survival and grinding work. You chat about the usual topics that concern ordinary Romans, the ever-increasing taxes that seem to disappear into the imperial bureaucracy without visible benefit to your neighborhood, the unusually hot or cold weather and its effect on crop prices. Which neighbor got fined for urinating in public again, despite the presence of public latrines throughout the city? You laugh, but not too loudly. The apartment walls are thin, and your neighbor is trying to get a fussy baby to sleep. Its wails occasionally penetrating the plaster and wood separating your living spaces. As darkness falls, the city gets quiet, quieter anyway. Without streetlights to extend the day, activities diminish. With the setting sun, oil is expensive, and most people cannot afford to burn lamps for hours just for the luxury of staying awake. You light an oil lamp, a simple clay vessel with a wick protruding from a hole in the top. Nothing like the elaborate bronze lamps depicted in museums that only the wealthy could afford. It smokes slightly, the wick perhaps needing trimming, the cheap oil producing more soot than light. The smell fills the room, acrid and distinctive, joining the medley of odors that make up your personal environment. Sweat, cooking, the faint whiff of human waste from the chamber pot in the corner, the ever-present mustiness of your straw mattress. You lie back on your uncomfortable bed, scratch a few new flea bites that have appeared since morning, feeling their raised welts under your fingernails, and close your eyes. Perhaps you say a quick prayer to your household gods, the Lares and Penates, who watch over your humble dwelling, asking for protection through the vulnerable hours of sleep, for health and continued employment, for the simple security of waking to another day largely like this one. The gods may be distant and capricious, but it costs nothing to acknowledge them, to maintain the ancient practices that connect you to your ancestors and to Roman tradition. Tomorrow will be the same. Another chorus of roosters, another round of porridge eaten, standing by the window, another day of sore feet, sweaty clothes, and public sponges. The cycle repeats with minimal variation, marked primarily by the changing seasons and religious festivals that provide brief respites from the monotony. Still think time travel would be fun. Still romanticize the glory of ancient Rome, the grandeur of the empire, the wisdom of the philosophers, the monuments and statues, the temples and triumphal arches, the literature and legal codes that continue to influence our world, all built on the backs of ordinary people, living lives of hardship we can scarcely imagine. People using communal sponge sticks and drinking from contaminated fountains, scratching flea bites and struggling up dark stairwells, working from dawn to dusk without labor protections or safety standards. And yet, in spite of all this, the people around you live. They don't just survive. They find moments of joy and connection. They laugh together over simple meals. They fall in love, marry, raise children, despite the dangers of childbirth and high infant mortality. They tell stories, passing down family histories and popular tales, adding embellishments with each retelling. They watch the stars and wonder about the gods, seeking meaning in celestial movements and natural phenomena. They make do with what they have, finding small pleasures in a fig that's perfectly ripe, or a day when the public bath is less crowded, or a festival that brings music and dancing to the streets. They always do. Humans adapt. They find ways to normalize even the most challenging conditions, to create community and meaning even in environments we would consider intolerable. This resilience, this ability to not just endure, but to find purpose and even joy in difficult circumstances, may be the most remarkable aspect of human experience throughout history. So rest now, drift off to sleep on your lumpy, flea-infested mattress, in your tiny apartment with its thin walls and smoky lamp. Dream of better things, perhaps, or simply accept this life, the only one you've ever known, with all its hardships and simple pleasures, its limitations and social connections, its grinding routine, and occasional moments of transcendence. Because in the next chapter, we'll take a darker turn. Let's explore the shadows that hid behind the marble columns, the aspects of Roman life that didn't make it into the glorified histories and romantic reconstructions, the underbelly of the empire where slaves labored, where disease ran rampant, where violence was casual and death was omnipresent. Chapter 3. All right, you've made it through your first day in the Roman Empire. Barely. Your modern sensibilities have been assaulted by communal toilets, questionable water sources, bland food, and living conditions that would violate every building code in the developed world. You've experienced the endless physical labor, the constant odors, the lack of privacy, the persistent insects, and the general discomfort that characterized daily existence for the average Roman. Now, as your imaginary straw mattress starts to feel a little more tolerable under your exhausted body, as the sounds of the city diminish to a quiet murmur of distant voices and occasional animal noises, let's dim the oil lamp and peer into the shadows. Let's go beyond the mere discomforts of daily life and examine the truly harrowing aspects of existence in the Roman world. Because for all its architecture, law codes, and public baths, the Roman Empire had a darker side, a much darker side. And no, I don't just mean the lack of indoor lighting, the preference for blackout conditions that our ancient predecessors shared with modern astronomers and photographers. Let's start with mortality, or rather, the frequency of it, the omnipresent reality of death that shaped psychology, religion, and social structures in ways we can barely comprehend from our position of relative biological security. You wouldn't last long here, statistically speaking. If you made it past infancy, you were already defying the odds. Nearly 1/3 of Roman babies didn't make it past their first birthday. Succumbing to diseases modern medicine has largely conquered, diarrheal illnesses from contaminated water, respiratory infections, congenital conditions that now would be treated surgically or with antibiotics. Parents experienced loss so commonly that many didn't even name their children until they had survived their first year, a psychological defense mechanism against the pain of attachment to a being so likely to be snatched away. Half of all children were dead by age 10. Think about that for a moment. In a group of 20 children born in the Roman Empire, only 10 would live to see their 10th birthday. That means your average 10-year-old had already attended more funerals than birthday parties, had watched siblings, cousins, friends waste away from illness or succumb to accidents without the benefit of emergency medicine. That average 10-year-old understood death intimately, had helped prepare small bodies for burial, had witnessed parental grief, had perhaps developed a stoicism about mortality that modern children are mercifully spared. And if you did reach adulthood, congratulations. You might enjoy a life expectancy of about 35 to 40 years. Maybe, if you were lucky, if you didn't get stabbed in a street robbery, catch the plague during one of the periodic epidemics that swept through urban centers, or die from an infected blister acquired during your daily labor. Women faced the additional peril of childbirth, with each pregnancy representing a significant risk of death from hemorrhage, infection, or complications that would be easily managed in a modern hospital, but were largely untreatable in the ancient world. These aren't just cold statistics. This reality of early and frequent death shaped everything from family structures to religious beliefs, from economic arrangements to philosophical outlooks. The Stoic emphasis on accepting what cannot be changed, the religious focus on afterlife and ancestral spirits, the legal systems designed to handle frequent transfers of property due to unexpected deaths, all emerge from a world where mortality wasn't an abstract concept but a daily companion. Medicine, as we understand it, did not exist. There were physicians, certainly, some quite knowledgeable about anatomy and medicinal plants, but their understanding of disease processes, their diagnostic capabilities, and their treatment options were severely limited by the lack of scientific method, the absence of microscopes to identify pathogens, and the non-existence of standardized pharmaceutical preparations. Let's say you catch a cold, a simple virus that today might mean a day of bed rest, some over-the-counter medications, and perhaps a sick day from work. Sounds manageable, right? In the Roman world, even this minor illness could develop into pneumonia without antibiotics to prevent secondary bacterial infections. And the treatments? You'll get bloodletting, possibly a dose of some concoction containing lead or mercury compounds, or advice to sleep with an amulet of dubious origin under your pillow. Some doctors might recommend drilling a hole in your head, trepanation, to release bad humors. For a headache, a treatment that might cause infection, brain damage, or death to address a condition that modern medicine would treat with 2 aspirin and a glass of water. Dental care, non-existent in any form we would recognize. Toothpaste hadn't been invented yet. But if you're lucky, someone might recommend chewing on a stick or rinsing with urine. Yes, really. The ammonia content was thought to have cleansing properties. Your teeth would be ground down from coarse bread full of sand and stone particles from the grinding process used to create flour, with grit from hand-operated mills contributing to significant dental wear, cavities unchecked until the pain became unbearable, at which point extraction was the only option, performed without anesthesia, using crude tools that resembled modern pliers. Tooth abscess, a potentially fatal condition as the infection could spread to the brain. Good luck. And then there was disease, not just individual illness, but widespread epidemics that could devastate entire regions. Epidemics swept through the empire with eerie regularity. The Antonine Plague, possibly smallpox, killed an estimated 5 million people between 165 and 180 CE. The Plague of Cyprian, hitting a century later, caused up to 5,000 deaths per day in Rome alone at its peak. These weren't just public health crises. They were existential threats to the stability of the empire itself, disrupting trade, reducing tax revenue, depleting the ranks of the army, and creating social unrest as supernatural explanations fueled religious persecution. Nobody knew how germs worked. They couldn't see bacteria or viruses. They had no concept of contagion through microscopic organisms. They thought it was bad air, miasma, carrying disease from place to place, or the wrath of the gods, punishment for impiety or moral failings, or maybe your neighbor's bad luck was just contagious, their misfortune somehow leaking into your household through proximity or association. These beliefs weren't just a superstition. They were the best explanations available given the observational tools and conceptual frameworks of the time. Which brings us to religion and fear, the pervasive anxiety that characterized a life where so much was beyond human control, where patterns of cause and effect were poorly understood, where natural phenomena could spell the difference between abundance and starvation. Romans were deeply superstitious by modern standards, their daily lives governed by rituals, observances, and interpretations of omens that would strike us as obsessive. Every creak in the floor, every odd bird call, every sneeze could be a sign from the gods. Auspices, the practice of divining the future through various natural phenomena, influenced personal decisions and state policy alike. Lightning strikes were particularly significant, their location and timing carefully noted and interpreted by religious authorities. Dreams were analyzed for prophetic content. The entrails of sacrificial animals were examined for abnormalities that might reveal divine displeasure. They worshipped a whole pantheon: Jupiter, Mars, Venus, and dozens of other major and minor deities, but also household spirits like the Lares and Penates, local deities tied to specific springs or groves or crossroads, and sometimes even their emperors, elevating political authority to the realm of the divine. Religion wasn't a separate sphere of life. It was interwoven with politics, with family dynamics, with warfare, with agriculture, with all aspects of existence. Yes, emperors, many were deified after death, joining the ranks of gods to be worshipped by subsequent generations. Some, like Caligula, even demanded to be worshipped while they were still alive, blurring the line between political obedience and religious devotion in ways that made even Romans uncomfortable. That's right. Imagine your boss telling you to build a shrine in their honor at your workplace, to offer sacrifices to their genius, divine spirit, to include them in your daily prayers alongside Mars and Jupiter. Then imagine they actually had the power to make you do it, to punish refusal as not just insubordination, but impiety, a crime against both state and cosmic order. Sacrifices were a regular affair, consuming significant resources and permeating urban centers with the smell of burning flesh and smoke. Animals, mostly cattle, sheep, pigs, birds, their throats cut and bodies burned on altars throughout the city. Occasionally, people in earlier days or in the more remote regions of the empire where indigenous practices merged with Roman colonial rule, rituals had to be performed exactly right, with precise words spoken in the correct order, specific gestures made at appropriate moments. One wrong word, one slip in the ceremonial procedure, and the whole thing had to be restarted from the beginning. The gods, apparently, were sticklers for detail, more concerned with procedural correctness than the spirit of devotion. And what happened when bad things did occur? Despite all these religious observances, famine, war, plague, it wasn't poor sanitation or political incompetence or climatic shifts beyond human control. It was divine punishment. Someone had angered the gods. Perhaps traditional practices had been neglected. Perhaps foreign cults had polluted the purity of Roman worship. Perhaps moral decay had weakened the cosmic order. Cue another sacrifice, more elaborate this time, more prayers, more desperate attempts to appease supernatural forces that seemed increasingly capricious. Then there's slavery, the unspoken engine behind the Roman economy, the human fuel that powered everything from agriculture to education, from mining to household management. The inconvenient truth behind those magnificent monuments and leisurely philosophical discussions. Nearly 1/3 of the population were enslaved at some point in their lives. Let that sink in. Walking through a Roman city, every third person you encountered might be property rather than a citizen, or even a free non-citizen captured in war as entire cities and regions were conquered, born into servitude from enslaved mothers, or sold by desperate families unable to feed another mouth. The paths into slavery were varied, but the condition itself was ubiquitous. Slaves built roads, quarried stone, harvested crops, taught children, kept financial records, served food, entertained crowds, provided sexual services, and died in droves, their labor extracted until their bodies failed, then replaced like worn-out tools. Mining was particularly deadly, with slaves working in conditions so toxic and dangerous that their life expectancy could be measured in months rather than years. Agricultural slaves fared somewhat better, but still endured brutal physical labor under harsh conditions, while household slaves might enjoy better material circumstances, but lived under constant surveillance and the threat of punishment for any perceived failing. Their lives, hard, uncertain, and mostly invisible to history. There were no rights as we understand them, no protections against abuse, no legal recourse for mistreatment. Slaves could be beaten, sexually assaulted, tortured, or killed with minimal consequences for their owners. There was no hope of retirement, no pension plan, no safety net for old age. If you were lucky, maybe you were freed, manumitted, after years of service, maybe after years of labor and obedience, after convincing your owner that your freedom served their interests, whether through payment, through skilled service, or through producing children who would remain enslaved. But freedom didn't guarantee safety or dignity. Freed slaves, liberty, faced ongoing social stigma, legal limitations, and continued obligations to their former masters. Now imagine you're one of them, your entire life dictated by someone else, no control over your body, your family, your future. You might be separated from your children at their birth, sold to different owners, never to see them again. You might be forced to satisfy your owner's sexual desires, to endure intimate violations without recourse or resistance. You might be working in a mine, your lungs filling with dust, your skin marked by accidents, your future measured in the increasingly labored breaths you take, all under the warm Mediterranean sun, perhaps within sight of those gleaming marble temples celebrating the greatness of Rome. And yes, while we're here, let's talk about crime and punishment, the methods of maintaining order in a society without modern policing, forensic science, or rehabilitative justice concepts. Rome didn't do innocent until proven guilty. That notion would have seemed absurd to them. Trials were dramatic, public, and often more about who had better connections than actual evidence. Rhetoric mattered more than facts. A skilled orator could sway a jury regardless of the merits of the case. Social status heavily influenced outcomes, with the word of a senator naturally carrying more weight than that of a freedman or foreigner. The concept of equality before the law existed in theory, but rarely in practice. Punishments ranged from fines to flogging to crucifixion, with severity determined as much by the offender's social status as by the nature of the crime. A wealthy citizen might be exiled for an offense that would earn a slave or foreigner a death sentence. Execution methods were deliberately brutal, designed not just to end life, but to serve as public spectacles that reinforced state power. And the infamous damnatio ad bestias, being thrown to wild animals in the arena, death as public entertainment. Imagine your worst performance review ever, followed by a lion tearing you limb from limb while thousands cheer. Speaking of arenas, let's discuss entertainment in the Roman world, the leisure activities that offer a window into Roman values, priorities, and psychological conditioning. Entertainment in Rome could be horrifying by modern standards. Gladiator fights were not choreographed Hollywood spectacles with minimal bloodshed and maximum drama. They were brutal, bloody, and often fatal encounters between men and occasionally women fighting for their lives. Sure, some gladiators became celebrities, their names graffitied on city walls alongside crude drawings of their exploits. Successful fighters could win prize money, fame, occasionally even freedom, but most were enslaved. forced to fight, and died young, their bodies discarded with as little ceremony as the animals they fought alongside. Public executions were scheduled between gladiatorial bouts or animal hunts, like halftime shows in a modern sporting event. They weren't just accepted, they were expected. People brought snacks, children came along, the crowd roared as criminals, prisoners of war, or disfavored groups like Christians met deaths designed to be as entertaining as they were agonizing. It was considered civic engagement, participation in collective justice, not a sign of individual cruelty to enjoy these spectacles. These weren't fringe events or underground entertainments. They were mainstream, state-sponsored activities attended by citizens of all classes. Even theater wasn't safe from the Roman appetite for real violence. Yes, there were plays, comedies, tragedies, mimes, performances similar to what we might recognize as entertainment today. But some special performances involved real violence. Occasionally, criminals would be killed on stage in scripted scenes, recreating myths or historical events. Actual death incorporated into theatrical production. Talk about method acting. The line between simulation and reality, between performance and execution, blurred in ways that reveal a fundamentally different relationship to violence than we cultivate in modern society. And if you happened to be a woman, your world was even more restricted than the already limited options available to lower-class men. Your value was defined primarily by your relationship to men, as daughter, wife, mother, rather than as an individual with inherent worth and autonomous desires. Women had limited rights, no formal political power, and were expected to marry young, often as teens, to men much older than them, creating relationships with significant power imbalances by design. Their primary value was tied to their ability to produce heirs, to manage a household according to male specifications, and to uphold family honor through displays of modesty and propriety. Women who failed to meet these expectations faced social ostracism, divorce, or worse. Higher-class women might enjoy some financial independence, particularly widows who managed family estates. Some wielded considerable indirect influence through male relatives. Exceptions existed. Women who defied convention to pursue education, business interests, or political machinations, but they were rare and often short-lived, their stories surviving precisely because they were unusual enough to merit comment. Life in the Roman Empire was not all marble and laurels. It was not the sanitized, heroic version presented in certain films and novels. It was pain, power, and politics. It was struggling to survive childhood illnesses without antibiotics, toiling under the Mediterranean sun without labor protections, navigating complex religious obligations without clear guidance on what might actually placate the gods. It was living in fear of slavery or in slavery itself. It was watching loved ones die from preventable conditions. It was accepting a level of everyday violence that would horrify modern sensibilities. And for most people, it was surviving, not living. It was finding enough food for today without certainty about tomorrow. It was maintaining social connections that might provide security in an uncertain world. It was performing religious rituals that might or might not protect you from capricious fate. It was enduring rather than flourishing, but still somehow people found moments of joy, a good harvest, a kind word from a respected elder, a beautiful sunset reflecting off the Mediterranean, or a bath that wasn't too crowded, where the water was still relatively clean, where for a brief moment you could relax muscles perpetually tensed against the next threat. That's the paradox of history, isn't it? The contradiction that makes the past simultaneously alien and recognizable. Even in the worst conditions, people carry on. They find ways to normalize their circumstances, to create meaning within constraint. They sing, they dance, they hope, they fall in love despite knowing its probable end in early death. They continue to have children despite the statistical likelihood of loss. They tell stories that connect them to something larger than their individual suffering. And speaking of stories, in the next chapter, we'll slow down, take a gentler pace. I'll tell you about some of the key events that shaped this empire, the ones that echo through time, even as we drift into sleep on our imaginary straw mattress, momentarily forgetting the fleas, the thin walls, the chamber pot in the corner, focusing instead on the grand narrative that makes Rome more than just a collection of discomforts and dangers, the story that transformed it into a civilization whose impact we still feel today. Chapter 4. Let's slow things down now. The frenetic pace of daily survival in the Roman Empire, with all its physical discomforts, its hazards, its grinding labor, can become overwhelming, even in this imaginary journey we're taking together. Let's step back from the immediate sensory assault of ancient urban life and allow our minds to contemplate the broader tapestry. You've made it through the grime and the gladiators, the porridge and the public sponges. You've witnessed the casual violence, the omnipresent slavery, the high mortality and limited medical options of the time. Let all of that fade into the background for a moment, dissolving into the quiet of history. Breathe in deeply, breathe out, fill your lungs with air, ignoring for now the imaginary odors of our reconstructed Roman environment with its stenches and miasmas. We're going to shift from the daily grind to the broader canvas, the stories that shaped the Roman Empire over centuries, transforming it from a small settlement on the Tiber River into a vast imperial project spanning 3 continents. These stories won't be loud. They won't be action-packed in the Hollywood sense, filled with clashing swords and thundering hooves. These stories are like soft echoes down a marble corridor of time. You can hear them if you listen carefully. Even from your warm bed in the 21st century, they've traversed millennia, whispering of ambition and betrayal, of innovation and stagnation, of rise and inevitable fall. Grand narrative arcs that historians have reconstructed from fragments of evidence, texts, artifacts, ruins, trying to make sense of a civilization both alien and familiar to us. So let's settle in comfortably and allow these gentle waves of history to envelop us, rocking us like a boat on the Tiber. carrying us through time and the meaning of events that echo in our modern world. We embark on a journey not merely through facts, but through how these events were perceived by the Romans themselves, how they influenced the collective consciousness of an entire civilization, how they continue to resonate in our contemporary culture and institutions. The founding of Rome, 753 BCE, approximately. Let's start with a myth, because every great civilization begins with a story, not a historical record, a narrative that embodies values, explains origins, justifies present arrangements, and connects people across time and space through shared cultural reference points. For Rome, this foundational myth typically involved twins and questionable parenting decisions, divine intervention and fratricide, themes we see recurring in the mythologies of many great civilizations. According to Roman legend, carefully cultivated over centuries, and finally written down by authors like Livy and Virgil, Rome was founded by Romulus and Remus, twin brothers with an exceptionally complicated family history, connecting the human and divine, chance, and the inevitability of fate. Their mother was a Vestal virgin, a priestess sworn to celibacy, named Rhea Silvia, who claimed pregnancy by the god Mars, presumably to avoid punishment for breaking her vows. According to other versions of the myth, Mars truly appeared to her in a dream, making the twins demigods, a connection that Romans would use centuries later to legitimize their imperial ambitions and assertions of divine right to rule. Their great-uncle was Amulius, who had usurped the throne of Alba Longa from their grandfather Numitor, and forced Rhea Silvia into the Vestal order specifically to prevent her from producing heirs who might challenge his rule. Politics and blood kinship intertwine from the very beginning of this story, establishing the tension between family bonds and state power that would characterize Roman political culture for centuries. When the twins were born, Amulius ordered them drowned in the Tiber, fearing a prophecy about his overthrow by his brother's descendants. But the servants charged with this infanticide apparently had qualms, so they placed the babies in a basket and set it afloat on the river instead, a recurring motif in Mediterranean mythologies, appearing in stories from Moses to Perseus. Such coincidence of plot lines is not accidental. It connects the Roman myth with older traditions, giving the new city a sense of continuity with noble civilizations of old. The basket eventually washed ashore, where the twins were found by a she-wolf. Yes, a literal wolf. Traditionally depicted as a strong and nurturing figure, the she-wolf becomes a surrogate mother for Rome's founders, creating a metaphorical link between the city and the wild, between civilization and primal force. Why a wolf? Because their human parents were too occupied with being overthrown and murdered. It's a whole narrative involving divine plans, prophecies, and the kind of dynastic politics that would make Game of Thrones seem straightforward by comparison. The wolf nursed the babies until a shepherd named Faustulus found them and brought them home to his wife, Acca Laurentius. Raised as shepherds, The twins eventually learned of their royal heritage, restored their grandfather to the throne of Alba Longa, and decided to found their own city on the spot where the wolf had saved them, the famous 7 Hills beside the Tiber. Disagreements arose over the exact location of the new city. Romulus preferred the Palatine Hill, while Remus favored the Aventine. They agreed to let the gods decide through augury, the observation of bird signs, a practice that would remain an important part of Roman religious and political life throughout the Republic's history. But each claimed favorable omens. Romulus saw 12 vultures, while Remus saw only 6. But Remus saw them first. The dispute escalated. Romulus began building a wall around his chosen site. Remus mockingly jumped over it to demonstrate its inadequacy, an act that can be interpreted as a boundary violation, a sacral transgression. Romulus eventually kills Remus because of sibling rivalry and border violations, and also because ancient myths are never gentle about family dynamics, and names the city after himself. Not exactly a feel-good family tale, but it gave Rome a mythic origin full of drama, destiny, and a casual disregard for fraternal affection. It also established several themes that would recur throughout Roman history: the tension between kinship and state loyalty, the importance of boundaries and their defense, the role of divine favor in political legitimacy, and the acceptance of violence as sometimes necessary for establishing order. After founding the city, Romulus faced another problem: the shortage of women for his followers, predominantly male exiles and adventure seekers. His solution? The infamous rape of the Sabine women, an event in which the Romans invited the neighboring Sabine tribe to a festival and then abducted their women. This act led to war, which ended, according to myth, when the abducted women themselves intervened, standing between their new husbands and their fathers and brothers, pleading with both sides for peace. This episode establishes another recurring theme in Roman cultural identity: the idea that Romans can assimilate other peoples, turning former enemies into part of their own society, an ideology that would serve imperial expansion in subsequent centuries. Of course, historians are quick to point out that all this didn't actually happen. Archaeological evidence suggests Rome developed gradually from settlements on the Palatine Hill, dating back to around the 10th century BCE, eventually merging with communities on surrounding hills. The founding date of 753 BCE was calculated centuries later by the scholar Varro, using methods that seem arbitrary by modern standards. But that's not the point. The Romans believed it, or at least they acted as if they believed it, which amounts to the same thing in terms of cultural impact. And belief can be more powerful than fact when it comes to shaping identity, justifying practices, and motivating collective action. The founding myth provided Romans with divine ancestry through Mars, connected them to the older Greek civilization through the Trojan diaspora. Another strand of the origin story claimed descent from the Trojan hero Aeneas, and established Rome's destiny as a city of power. From its very inception, it was history as propaganda, as identity formation, as social glue, and it worked remarkably well, providing ideological foundations for a civilization that would survive for over a millennium in various forms, from the Republic to the Empire. And then, after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, through Byzantium, or the Eastern Roman Empire, which lasted until 1453, this legend can be viewed as an early example of what is now called an invented tradition, the creation of practices and symbols that seem to have ancient origins but actually serve current political and social needs. Romans constantly revised and reworked their own history, combining actual events with mythical elements to create a narrative that reinforced their self-perception as a special people with a special destiny. This dynamic memory, this creative engagement with their own past, was a key characteristic of Roman cultural identity throughout the centuries. It's also worth noting how the founding myth reflects gendered aspects of Roman society. Rhea Silvia has no agency in the story. She is merely a vessel for divine intervention. The she-wolf, while powerful, is characterized primarily through nurturing, stereotypically feminine qualities. The Sabine women, despite their later heroism in stopping the war, are initially treated as property to be seized. These elements mirror the patriarchal structure of Roman society, where women had limited legal rights and were primarily valued for their reproductive capacity. The myth both reflects and reinforces these social arrangements, providing divine precedent for human institutions. The religious elements of the myth also deserve attention. Mars's paternity connects Roman military prowess directly to divine favor. The augury contest between the brothers establishes the importance of seeking divine approval for political decisions. These elements underscore how thoroughly religion and politics were intertwined in Roman culture, with religious rituals serving practical political functions and political power often justified through claims of divine support. This integration of religion and statecraft would remain a feature of Roman governance throughout its history, with emperors eventually becoming objects of worship themselves. For the average Roman, these stories weren't simply entertainment or abstract symbolism. They provided explanations for customs, justifications for social hierarchies, and a sense of collective identity in a world where belongingness to a community was essential for both physical survival and psychological well-being. They created a shared vocabulary of cultural references that allowed Romans from diverse backgrounds to communicate across social boundaries, unifying a heterogeneous population under a common narrative framework. The founding myth's enduring power is evident in Roman art, with imagery of the wolf nursing the twins appearing on everything from elaborate sculptures to common household items. It became a visual shorthand for Romanness itself, instantly recognizable to anyone within the cultural sphere. This iconography helped spread Roman identity throughout the empire, providing a cohesive, symbolic language that transcended linguistic and ethnic differences among Rome's diverse subjects. Even in modern times, the she-wolf remains a potent symbol of Rome, appearing on the city's coat of arms and in countless touristic representations. The Capitoline wolf, a bronze sculpture depicting the she-wolf with Romulus and Remus, though the twins were likely added during the Renaissance, continues to be one of Rome's most iconic artifacts. This cultural persistence demonstrates how founding myths can transcend their original contexts, evolving in meaning while maintaining symbolic power across millennia. Irritatory. The sack of Rome by the Gauls, 390 BCE. Now let's fast forward to a less glamorous moment, an event that Roman historians recorded with evident discomfort, but which played a crucial role in shaping Roman military policy and collective psychology for centuries to come. This event, unlike the legendary founding, has much more reliable historical evidence, though details, of course, may have been embellished for dramatic effect and moral instruction. The year is 390 BCE, or possibly 387 6 BCE. Ancient chronology can be imprecise, and different sources give varying dates for the same events. The Roman Republic is still young, still figuring out its political structures, still primarily a regional power concerned with controlling its immediate neighbors in central Italy rather than dreaming of Mediterranean dominance. The boundaries of Roman control and influence are still relatively modest, extending just a few dozen miles from the city itself. And then, bam, the Gauls, fierce warriors from the north, led by a chieftain named Brennus, march into Italy. These Celtic tribes came from regions that today we call France and northern Italy. They were known to the Romans for their tall stature, intimidating battle spirit, and, no less importantly, their foreignness. They did not belong to the same cultural world as the Italic peoples with whom the Romans were more familiar. The Gallic raid represented not just a military threat, but a clash of civilizations, an encounter with a significant other that challenged Romans' perceptions of their place in the world. The Gauls defeat the Roman army at the Battle of the Ilia, a humiliating rout that left Rome essentially defenseless. According to Roman sources, the army was not merely defeated, but completely demoralized, with some soldiers throwing down their weapons and fleeing without even attempting to maintain formation, the greatest dishonor for a warrior in antiquity. This trauma was so profound that the Romans subsequently declared the day of the battle, July 18th, by their calendar, Dies Aliensis, an unlucky day when no important events or religious ceremonies could be conducted. The Gauls enter the city itself. Most of the population flees, some finding refuge in neighboring towns, carrying away what few valuables they can bear. A small group of defenders retreats to the Capitoline Hill, the citadel at the heart of Rome, prepared for a last stand, presumably under the command of Marcus Manlius Capitolinus, who would later become known as the savior of the capital, and then, paradoxically, be executed for aspiring to kingship. Another reminder of the complexity of Roman politics and the tension between military leadership and republican principles, the invaders sack the rest of the city, burning buildings, looting temples, desecrating sacred sites. Imagine the smoke rising from the city's hills, the sound of collapsing buildings, the screams of those citizens who couldn't escape, the clang of Gallic warriors' weapons as they marched through streets previously filled with merchants and politicians. For the Romans, it was the end of the world, the collapse of order, horrifying images that would never be forgotten, even as the city was rebuilt and expanded. It's Rome's first major trauma as a collective entity, a national nightmare that would haunt Roman consciousness from this moment forward, appearing in literature, informing military strategy, and serving as a cautionary tale about the consequences of unpreparedness for a people who had begun to define themselves through their invincibility, through the myth of divine destiny. This was not merely a military defeat, but an existential crisis requiring a new understanding of their identity and fate. According to tradition, the siege of the Capitoline lasted 7 months. At one point, the Gauls almost succeeded in a night attack, scaling the steep slopes in darkness, using the same shepherd's paths that, ironically, according to myth, had led Romulus and Remus to the hills centuries earlier. But the sacred geese, kept in the temple of Juno, raised an alarm with their honking, awakening the defenders in time to repel the assault. These geese would be honored annually in Roman ceremony thereafter, a reminder that even poultry played its part in the survival of the state. Such apocryphal details make the story more memorable and add elements of divine providence. Juno, the temple's guardian, protected her devoted followers through her sacred animals. Eventually, the Romans negotiated with the Gauls for their departure, probably because disease and lack of supplies were making the siege increasingly difficult for the invaders. Though Roman sources naturally emphasize other factors, giving their people a more heroic aura. The invaders even demand a ransom to leave. Gold, weighed on scales. According to Livy, this was 1,000 pounds of gold, an enormous sum for a city still recovering from the devastation of the invasion and struggling with food shortages. When the Romans complain that the weights are rigged, that the Gauls are secretly adding weight to their side of the scales, the Gallic leader Brennus throws his sword onto the scales and says, "Vae victis," woe to the vanquished. It's one of those phrases that sticks, that encapsulates an entire worldview in 2 words. It haunted the Roman psyche for centuries. This blunt articulation of the harsh realities of power, the laconic verdict of the stronger. To lose is to suffer, to be at the mercy of the victor, to have no recourse to justice or fairness. Might creates its own law, its own morality. The Gauls could change the rules of the game because they had swords to give weight to their demands. And from then on, Rome became obsessed with never being the vanquished, never again experiencing the humiliation of occupation, never finding themselves on the wrong side of that sword on the scale. They would never again have vae victis pronounced by an invader in their city. They would be the ones dictating terms, the ones setting the rules of the game. They would never forget the trauma of the Gallic sack, and they made it their mission to conquer before being conquered, to establish buffers of controlled territory around the city, to maintain standing armies that could respond to threats, to develop diplomatic networks that would provide early warning of potential dangers. The Gauls were the first to teach them a lesson. The world is dangerous, and the only true security lies in domination. The sack becomes a foundational moment in Roman military thinking, teaching lessons about vigilance, preparedness, and the existential nature of security threats that would inform expansion for generations. It is not an exaggeration to say that the Mediterranean world was eventually transformed by an event lasting less than a year in a small city on the Tiber, as this sack generated psychological and institutional changes that would transform a regional power into a world empire. In subsequent centuries, Gauls periodically appeared in Roman literature and art as archetypal enemies, barbarians at the gates. The tradition of remembering and lamenting the Gallic invasion became so strong that 6 centuries later, when the Celtic queen Boadicea raised a rebellion against Roman rule in Britain, Roman authors compared this event to the events of 390 BCE, drawing a direct line between traumas across centuries. This lasting impact on collective memory illustrates how deeply this event was embedded in Roman identity. The sack also transformed Rome physically. Archaeological evidence confirms a significant rebuilding period following the Gallic occupation, with newer structures showing improved defensive capabilities. Urban planning became more strategic, with considerations of security influencing architectural decisions. The Romans began to take more seriously the maintenance of their defensive walls, an infrastructure project that would continue to evolve throughout their history, culminating in the massive Aurelian walls built in the 3rd century CE, which still partially stand today. The religious impact was equally profound. Romans interpreted the disaster as divine punishment for neglecting proper rituals or for some collective impiety. This reinforced the importance of maintaining correct religious observances, further integrating religious practice with state security in Roman consciousness. Temples destroyed in the sack were rebuilt with greater magnificence, emphasizing Rome's resilience and renewed commitment to honoring the gods who had allowed them to survive this catastrophe. More subtly, the sack influenced Roman attitudes toward foreigners and cultural difference. While Rome would eventually become remarkably multicultural, absorbing and adapting elements from conquered peoples, there remained an underlying wariness, a readiness to perceive external difference as potential threat. This ambivalence between openness to cultural exchange and xenophobic self-protection would characterize Roman interactions with non-Romans throughout their imperial history. Economically, the sack accelerated the development of more sophisticated financial systems to fund military expansion and defensive preparations. The need to rebuild the city and strengthen its defenses required significant capital mobilization, pushing Rome toward financial innovations that would later support its imperial ambitions. The trauma literally reshaped the physical and institutional landscape of the emerging power. In Roman education, the story of the Gallic sack became a standard moral tale, teaching children about the virtues of vigilance and the consequences of complacency. Young Romans grew up hearing about Marcus Manlius, awakened by the sacred geese, about the heavy weight of Brennus's sword on the scales, about the shame of defeat and the determination never to experience such humiliation again. These lessons were internalized generation after generation, becoming part of what it meant to be Roman. The psychological impact extended beyond military doctrine to influence Roman art and literature. Themes of resilience after catastrophe, of rebirth following destruction, appear repeatedly in Roman cultural production. The poet Virgil, writing over 3 centuries after the event, would echo elements of the Gallic sack in his Aeneid, connecting Rome's mythical Trojan origins with its historical trauma, creating a narrative of destined greatness emerging from devastating setback. This literary response demonstrates how thoroughly the event had been integrated into Roman cultural consciousness, becoming part of their narrative of divine destiny. Some historians, it should be noted, question aspects of this traditional account, suggesting it may have been exaggerated or modified in later retellings to enhance its moral and political utility. But again, what matters for our purposes is how the Romans themselves understood this event and how it shaped their subsequent attitudes and policies. A myth, fully embraced, has its own historical efficacy, regardless of its factual accuracy. Photo 3. The assassination of Julius Caesar, 44 BCE. Now let's move to more familiar territory, to an event so iconic it has been dramatized countless times in literature, theater, film, and television, becoming almost more legend than history, despite its firm grounding in historical record. An event that marks not only a turning point in Roman history, but one of the great historical transitions of Western civilization, from republican forms of governance to imperial ones. Julius Caesar, a name so recognizable, so laden with cultural associations, that it's practically shorthand for power itself. Subsequently, his name became the title for rulers in multiple languages: Kaiser, Tsar, highlighting his enduring impact on concepts of authority extending far beyond his own era and culture. He was a general who conquered Gaul, adding vast territories to Roman control and avenging 3.5 centuries later the humiliation inflicted by the Gauls when they sacked Rome. He was a political reformer who championed the interests of common citizens against senatorial elites, seeking to break the monopoly on power held by the few aristocratic families that had dominated Roman politics for generations. He was a populist who distributed land to the poor, revised debt laws to ease the burden on ordinary people, and revised the calendar we still use in modified form today, an achievement that maintains his presence in our daily lives even after more than 2 millennia. He was a writer whose lucid prose about his military campaigns remains a staple in Latin education, a model of simple yet effective communication. His famous line, Veni, Vidi, Vici, I came, I saw, I conquered, illustrates his stylistic minimalism, his ability to convey complex events with laconic confidence. His literary and educational reforms would have been sufficient for him to remain a historical figure, even without his military and political achievements. And depending on whom you ask, he was either a visionary who recognized the Republic's flaws and sought necessary changes to save it, or a manipulator and power-hungry individual whose ambitions threatened centuries-old constitutional traditions that had guided Rome since the expulsion of the kings 5 centuries earlier. This duality in assessment of his motives and legacy continues to this day, with historians still debating whether Caesar was the savior or destroyer of the Republic, debates that speak to the enduring power of his personality and the complex questions his life raises about the interplay of personal ambition and the necessity for systemic change. In 44 BCE, after years of civil war had already undermined republican institutions, fracturing the Roman people into warring factions and spilling blood across the Mediterranean, after defeating his rival Pompey and his supporters in a high-stakes conflict, after being named dictator initially for 10 years and then for life, a significant departure from the traditional 6-month emergency appointment for addressing specific crises, Caesar heads to a meeting of the Senate. The location is the theater of Pompey, not the usual Senate house, which had been destroyed by fire and was in the process of reconstruction. An ironic choice, given Caesar's defeat of Pompey in their power struggle. One can imagine Caesar entering this space with a complex mix of emotions: triumph at having achieved unprecedented power, wariness from years of political maneuvering, where trust was a rare commodity, perhaps even a touch of hubris from repeated successes that might have led him to underestimate the depth of resentment his rise had generated among the traditional elite. He probably should have seen it coming, the concentration of power in his hands, the honors he'd accepted that bordered on divine recognition, his image placed among the gods, a month renamed after him, statues erected throughout Rome, the rumors that he might accept a crown and formally end the Republic, the resentment among the traditional aristocracy who saw their privilege and influence diluted by his reforms, all created a volatile situation where different visions for Rome's future came into direct, irreconcilable conflict. A group of senators surround him, ostensibly to present a petition requesting that certain exiles be allowed to return to Rome, a seemingly routine piece of senatorial business. Words are exchanged, the exact content lost to history, but presumably some pretense to get close to Caesar without arousing suspicion. Daggers are drawn from beneath togas, weapons smuggled into a location where armed guards would typically be prohibited, revealing the careful planning behind what might otherwise appear as a spontaneous act of political violence. Caesar is stabbed 23 times by multiple assailants, men who had fought both against and alongside him in various configurations during the civil wars, men with complex individual motives ranging from genuine Republican principle to personal grievance to opportunistic political calculation. Approximately 60 men were involved in the conspiracy, though not all delivered blows. Among the assailants was Gaius Cassius Longinus, who had fought for Pompey but had been pardoned by Caesar after Pompey's defeat, a demonstration of Caesar's much vaunted clemency that ultimately proved fatal to him. Another was Decimus Junius Brutus Albinus, one of Caesar's most trusted lieutenants, whose betrayal would have been particularly shocking, but most famously involved was Marcus Junius Brutus, whose ancestor, Lucius Junius Brutus, had, according to Roman tradition, led the expulsion of the last king and established the Republic, a historical echo that would not have been lost on educated Romans of the time. Caesar falls at the foot of a statue of Pompey, blood pooling on the Senate floor. A finale both shocking and somehow theatrically appropriate for a man who had dominated Roman public life for decades. The symbolism would not have been lost on contemporary observers. The great Caesar dying beneath the image of the rival he had defeated, as if Pompey were extracting posthumous revenge for his own violent end in Egypt. Et tu, Brute? That's the famous line associated with the moment. You too, Brutus. A recognition of betrayal by Marcus Junius Brutus, a man Caesar had favored, whose mother Servilia had been Caesar's lover, who some even speculated might have been Caesar's illegitimate son, though it's from Shakespeare, not the historical record. Ancient sources suggest Caesar either said nothing as he died or spoke briefly in Greek to Brutus, saying, "You too, my child." The line captures something essential about the moment, the personal betrayal within the political act, the human drama inside the historical turning point. But again, believability over fact. The image of betrayal by a friend is timeless, resonating across cultures and eras, making the historical event accessible through emotional recognition. His death plunges Rome into renewed chaos. The conspirators had no coherent plan for what would follow the assassination. They seemed to believe that simply removing Caesar would automatically restore the Republic to its previous form, as if his rise had been an aberration rather than a symptom of deeper structural problems within the Roman political system. They were wrong. Instead of healing the Republic, the power vacuum created by Caesar's death intensified factional conflicts, revealing how dependent the functioning of the state had become on the very concentration of authority that the assassins had opposed. Civil wars erupt as various figures compete to fill the void. Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal lieutenant and co-consul, initially seems positioned to take control, delivering a stirring funeral oration that turned public opinion against the conspirators, forcing them to flee Rome for their safety. Then Octavian arrives on the scene, Caesar's young grandnephew and adopted son, named as primary heir in Caesar's will. A previously minor figure suddenly thrust into the center of Rome's most dangerous power struggles. Barely 18 years old, seemingly inexperienced, initially dismissed as a political lightweight, by more seasoned players like Antony and Cicero. But appearances proved deceiving. The complex maneuvering that followed, alliances formed and broken, armies raised and defeated, provinces gained and lost, is beyond our scope here. But the outcome is clear. Eventually, the Republic dies with Caesar, though not immediately, and not in the way anyone might have predicted. In the chaotic aftermath of the Ides of March, Rome transitions from a system of shared power with checks and balances, however imperfect, to one-man rule disguised with republican trappings. The form of the Republic would continue for decades. Elections still held, the Senate still meeting, consuls still appointed, but real power increasingly concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. It's the beginning of the empire, though no one would use that term publicly for some time, a turning point where centuries of republican governance gave way to a new system that would itself endure for centuries more, the culmination of trends that had been developing for generations. The inability of republican institutions to govern an empire, the rise of powerful generals with personal armies loyal to them rather than to the state, the economic disparities that made populist appeals effective, the factional violence that made security seem more valuable than liberty to many Romans. The assassination and its aftermath reveal much about Roman society in this period. The fact that violence was seen as a legitimate political tool by elite actors demonstrates how far the Republic had already decayed from its constitutional ideals. The rapid shift in public opinion from initial support for the liberators to condemnation after Antony's funeral speech shows the crucial importance of popular opinion, even in a system not formally democratic. The ultimate victory of Octavian over more experienced rivals illustrates how fluid power had become, detached from traditional sources of legitimacy and increasingly dependent on personal charisma, client networks, and military support. The event has fascinated poets, playwrights, painters, and filmmakers for centuries, not just for its dramatic qualities, but for the profound questions it raises about political legitimacy, the tension between individual ambition and collective governance, the morality of political violence, and the balance between reform and revolution. Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, written over 1,600 years after the events it depicts, remains one of the most probing explorations of the assassination's moral and political complexities, asking questions about motivation and consequence that still resonate in modern political discourse. For Romans themselves, the assassination and its chaotic aftermath became a cautionary tale about the fragility of political systems, the unintended consequences of well-intentioned actions, and the difficulty of preserving republican liberty in the face of expansion, inequality, and factionalism. These lessons would influence political thought throughout Western history, from Machiavelli's reflections on republican virtue to the American founding fathers' concerns about designing institutions that could withstand the pressures that had destroyed Rome's republic. Caesar's posthumous deification by the Senate, engineered by his heir Octavian, added religious dimensions to the political transition. The appearance of a comet shortly after his death was interpreted as his soul ascending to the heavens, a convenient astronomical event that Octavian leveraged to enhance his own position as son of a god. This blending of politics and religion would characterize the imperial system that followed, with the emperor increasingly positioned as a semi-divine figure whose authority derived not just from constitutional position, but from unique personal qualities and divine favor. The assassination also transformed Roman urban space. Caesar's cremation site in the Forum became a place of popular pilgrimage, and eventually the site of the Temple of Divus, Julius, the divine Julius, Octavian, later Augustus, would systematically redesign Rome's civic center to emphasize connections to his divine adoptive father, using architecture and urban planning to reinforce the new political reality. The physical city became a three-dimensional expression of the new order emerging from the chaos of the assassination and subsequent civil wars. Even the date, the Ides of March, March 15th, acquired a superstitious significance that persists in Western culture, a shorthand for impending doom or unexpected betrayal. The assassination left linguistic and cultural imprints that extend far beyond the specific historical circumstances, becoming part of our shared vocabulary for discussing power, conspiracy, and political violence. Before the reign of Augustus, 27 BCE to 14 CE, Octavian, Caesar's heir, emerges victorious from the post-assassination chaos after forming temporary alliances with Mark Antony and eliminating other rivals, including the assassins Brutus and Cassius, who were defeated at the Battle of Philippi in 42 BCE. He eventually turns against Antony as well, defeating him and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE. By 27 BCE, he stands unchallenged. The sole power in Rome, the bloody civil wars that had plagued Rome intermittently for nearly a century, are finally concluded, leaving the Roman world exhausted but unified under a single authority, now known as Augustus, a title granted by the Senate, with religious overtones suggesting something revered or sacred. He was formerly called Octavian, Caesar's adopted son and political heir, and while he didn't have the military flair of his predecessor, the battlefield charisma, the strategic brilliance that had conquered Gaul, he had something arguably more valuable: patience, political cunning, a willingness to play the long game rather than seek immediate gratification of his ambitions. If Caesar's trajectory had been meteoric, brilliant, fast-moving, but ultimately short-lived, Augustus was more like a slowly rising sun, whose light gradually but inexorably transformed the landscape. He played the long game magnificently. He didn't call himself a king, a title still toxic in Roman political culture. Centuries after the expulsion of the Tarquins and the founding of the Republic, he didn't declare himself a god during his lifetime, avoiding the charges of arrogance that had contributed to Caesar's assassination. Not right away, not overtly, not in ways that would provoke the kind of resistance Caesar had faced. He was keenly aware of the fate that had befallen his adoptive father and determined not to repeat his mistakes, preserving the substance of power while avoiding its most provocative symbols. Instead, he took on the title Princeps, First Citizen, a clever mask for absolute power, implying he was merely first among equals rather than fundamentally different from other senators. He maintained the forms of republican governance while emptying them of independent authority. Consuls were still elected, but they didn't challenge his wishes. The Senate still met, but increasingly to ratify his decisions rather than to debate policy alternatives. He accumulated various traditional offices and powers: tribune of the plebs, Pontifex Maximus, Imperator, combining them in unprecedented ways, while carefully avoiding any title that might suggest monarchy explicitly. He claimed to have restored the republic, when in fact he had replaced it with a monarchy in all but name, a political sleight of hand so deft that most Romans seem to have accepted or even welcomed the transition after decades of civil conflict. Under Augustus, Rome flourished in material terms. Roads were built connecting distant provinces, facilitating trade and military movement, creating infrastructure that would serve Rome for centuries and still impresses modern engineers. Temples were restored, public buildings constructed, aqueducts expanded, the city itself transformed from brick to marble. According to his famous boast, "I found Rome a city of bricks and left it a city of marble." This wasn't mere hyperbole. Archaeological evidence confirms a massive building program that reshaped the urban landscape, with new forums, temples, theaters, and administrative structures rising throughout the capital and in provincial cities across the empire. And peace was established after years of civil war that had disrupted commerce, destroyed property, and left many Romans longing for stability at any cost, even the surrender of political liberty. This period became known as the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, a concept more complex than simply the absence of war. It represented a new social contract. Romans would accept the emperor's authority in exchange for security, prosperity, and the reliable administration of justice. This peace would last, with periodic interruptions, for about 2 centuries, an unprecedented era of relative stability in the Mediterranean world that enabled the flourishing of commerce, arts, and the spread of Roman cultural institutions throughout Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. People could exhale after decades of uncertainty. Commerce thrived in secure conditions, benefiting merchants and consumers alike. Trade routes that had been disrupted by conflict and piracy were secured by Roman naval power and the elimination of competing states. Standardized currency, weights, and measures facilitated long-distance transactions. Legal codes were harmonized across diverse regions, reducing the friction that had previously hindered economic integration. The arts blossomed under imperial patronage, producing the works of Virgil, Horace, and Ovid that would define Latin literature for generations. Architects and engineers were employed in ambitious public works projects, developing techniques and styles that would influence construction for centuries to come. Rome became less of a scrappy city-state, battling for regional dominance, and more of an empire in every sense, a vast, multicultural entity that encompassed diverse peoples, administered varied territories, and projected power across 3 continents. Augustus's reign saw significant administrative innovations that transformed governance. The professional civil service expanded, creating career paths for talented men from diverse backgrounds who could rise through merit rather than solely through aristocratic connections. Provincial administration was systematized with clearer lines of authority and accountability. The military was reorganized into a standing, professional force with standardized training, equipment, and benefits, including provisions for veterans that tied their interests to the stability of the imperial system. These institutional changes created a more effective state apparatus that could implement policy across vast distances and diverse cultural contexts. The relationship between center and periphery also evolved during this period. While Rome remained the undisputed capital, provincial cities gained importance as administrative hubs and cultural centers in their own right. Local elites were increasingly incorporated into the imperial project through grants of citizenship, opportunities for advancement, and the spread of Roman material culture and social practices. This process, sometimes called Romanization, was not simply cultural imperialism, but a complex negotiation in which provincial communities selectively adopted and adapted Roman elements while maintaining aspects of their indigenous traditions. The result was a remarkably diverse yet coherent cultural commonwealth, spanning widely different environments and ethnic groups. Augustus also undertook significant social reforms, attempting to address moral and demographic concerns that many Romans believed had contributed to the Republic's decline. Laws encouraging marriage and reproduction among the elite, punishing adultery, and regulating luxury consumption reflected his determination to reshape not just political institutions, but social and family structures as well. He promoted a return to traditional Roman values, mos maiorum, positioning himself as not a revolutionary, but a restorer of ancient virtues. This moral dimension of his rule gave it ideological coherence beyond mere personal power, presenting the Principate as the continuation of Rome's historical mission rather than its subversion. In religious matters, Augustus revived ancient cults and priesthoods that had fallen into neglect during the turbulent late Republic. He personally assumed the role of Pontifex Maximus, chief priest, integrating religious and political authority. The cult of Rome and Augustus emerged in the provinces, providing a religious framework for imperial loyalty without explicitly claiming divinity for the living emperor within Rome itself, though his genius or divine spirit could be honored. These religious innovations provided supernatural legitimacy for the new political order while respecting traditional Roman reluctance to worship living rulers as gods. Another example of Augustus's careful balancing of innovation and tradition. The visual culture of the Augustan age reflected and reinforced these political changes. Official portraiture showed Augustus as eternally youthful, calm, and dignified, the human embodiment of the stability and security he promised. Public monuments like the Ara Pacis, Altar of Peace, combined complex historical narrative with idealized imagery, presenting the imperial family as models of virtue and piety while connecting them to Rome's mythical past. A coherent visual language developed that could be replicated across the empire, creating a shared symbolic vocabulary that transcended linguistic and cultural differences. This sophisticated use of imagery for political communication would become a hallmark of imperial governance. Literature flourished under imperial patronage, particularly through the influence of Augustus's friend and advisor Maecenas, who supported poets like Virgil, Horace, and Propertius. These writers produced works that engaged with the themes of Rome's destiny, the costs and benefits of empire, and the relationship between personal and public values. While clearly supportive of the new regime, their works were not simple propaganda, but complex artistic creations that could subtly explore the contradictions and ambiguities of the Augustan settlement. The Aeneid, Virgil's epic poem linking Rome's foundation to Trojan refugees and divine destiny, became almost a national scripture, providing mythical legitimacy for Rome's imperial mission. And Augustus's role as its fulfiller. Was everything perfect? Of course not. Slavery continued unabated, with millions of human beings treated as property, their labor and bodies exploited to create the wealth that sustained Roman elite lifestyles. Provincial exploitation funded urban magnificence with tax systems that often placed heavy burdens on agricultural producers to support military expenditures and spectacles in Rome and other cities. Dissenters were silenced through various means, not always violent repression, but often the more subtle pressures of social conformity, patronage dependency, and the careful management of public discourse. Women remained largely excluded from public life, despite the visible role of imperial women like Livia in court circles and symbolic representations. Economic inequality persisted and may have worsened as wealth was concentrated among those with connections to the imperial household and administrative apparatus. The transformation from republic to empire also carried psychological and ideological costs that some Romans continued to feel acutely. The ideal of libertas, freedom, specifically the freedom of elite men to participate equally in governance without a monarch, had been central to Roman political identity for centuries. While Augustus carefully avoided the trappings of kingship, the reality of his dominance required psychological adjustments and new conceptual frameworks. Writers like Tacitus, looking back on the Augustan settlement from later decades, would question whether the benefits of peace and stability had been worth the surrender of Republican liberty, beginning a debate about the nature of freedom and authority that continues in political philosophy to this day. For the average Roman, however, these abstract concerns likely paled beside the concrete improvements in daily life. After decades of warfare, proscriptions, and economic disruption, a regime that provided security, stable food supplies, public entertainment, and predictable legal processes was welcomed with relief. Augustus understood the importance of addressing these material concerns, establishing systems like the grain dole that ensured urban populations remained fed and therefore less likely to become restive. His attention to infrastructure, not just monumental buildings, but practical necessities like aqueducts, harbors, and sewers, improved quality of life tangibly. Basic competence in governance, after years of dysfunction, was perhaps his greatest achievement and the foundation of his enduring popularity. But for a moment, things felt stable, predictable, manageable. The constant anxiety of civil war had subsided. The fear that Rome itself might collapse under the weight of its internal contradictions eased. There was a sense that the ship of state, which had been taking on water and listing dangerously, had been righted and was now sailing in calmer seas. Even if the captain had assumed powers the old republic would have found unacceptable, and after the bloodshed of previous decades, that felt revolutionary. 5. The Great Fire of Rome, 64 CE. Finally, let's float forward another century or so to one of the empire's more infamous events, one that combines urban disaster with political opportunism and religious persecution, revealing the complex intersections of power, public opinion, and religious identity in the imperial system. This incident, occurring during the reign of Emperor Nero, demonstrates how physical catastrophes could trigger social and political crises, exposing tensions that normally remained beneath the surface of Roman society. In 64 CE, a fire broke out in the city of Rome. In shops near the Circus Maximus, where flammable goods were stored, the location was no accident. This densely packed commercial district contained abundant fuel for a conflagration: oils, textiles, wooden storage containers, and various flammable merchandise. The fire swiftly spread through narrow streets and densely packed wooden buildings, those infamous insulae we discussed earlier, multi-story apartment blocks built cheaply and with minimal regard for fire safety. Many had wooden upper floors and exterior staircases that acted as chimneys, drawing flames upward and accelerating the spread. It burned for 6 days and 7 nights, according to Tacitus, a Roman historian writing a generation later, whose account remains our most detailed source. The intensity varied as the fire encountered different urban landscapes, slowing when reaching stone structures or open areas, accelerating when finding fresh fuel in crowded residential districts. 2/3 of the city was destroyed or damaged. Homes, businesses, temples, public buildings reduced to ash and rubble, the air choked with smoke, the skyline glowing with embers. Thousands rendered homeless, countless killed directly by flames or indirectly by smoke inhalation and trampling during desperate evacuation attempts. For a city of perhaps 1 million inhabitants, many living in precarious economic circumstances, with few possessions beyond what they wore and carried, this was a catastrophe of almost unimaginable proportions, and the emperor at the time, Nero, already controversial before the fire for his theatrical performances, his extravagant building projects, his mother's suspicious death, his elimination of potential rivals, including his stepbrother Britannicus, now facing the greatest urban disaster in Rome's history, a test of leadership that would challenge even the most competent administrator. His response would become one of the most contested aspects of his historical legacy, with contemporary accounts diverging dramatically depending on the author's political sympathies. Rumor had it he played the lyre while the city burned, perhaps even dressed in theatrical costume, performing his own composition about the fall of Troy as flames consumed his capital. This image of artistic detachment amid suffering has become one of the most enduring symbols of callous leadership, referenced across centuries whenever rulers seem indifferent to the plight of their subjects. Probably not true in literal terms. Tacitus, no friend to Nero, notes he was at Antium when the fire began and returned to organize relief efforts, including opening his gardens to refugees and constructing emergency shelters. But again, rumors have staying power when they align with existing narratives. The image of Nero fiddling, technically a violin anachronism, but the concept translates, while Rome burned, captures something people already suspected about his character: his detachment from ordinary suffering, his aesthetic obsessions overriding practical governance, his narcissism preventing empathy with his subjects. True or not, the rumor damaged Nero's already fragile reputation. Public opinion turned sharply against him, with whispers that perhaps the emperor himself had ordered the fire to clear land for his ambitious architectural projects, particularly the enormous palace complex he would later build, the Domus Aurea, or Golden House. This massive complex, covering perhaps 100-300 acres in the center of Rome, featuring artificial lakes, colonnaded courts, and innovative concrete domes, would indeed rise from the ashes of the fire, lending credence to suspicions about Nero's complicity. The emperor, who had earlier enjoyed some popularity with the common people for his public entertainments and distributions, now faced a crisis of legitimacy, and in response, Nero tried a political maneuver as old as governance itself: find a scapegoat, redirect public anger toward an outgroup, change the narrative from administrative failure or even imperial arson to external threat, deflect blame to a marginalized community that lacked political power to defend itself. This strategy has been employed countless times throughout history, from ancient scapegoating of religious minorities during plagues to modern politicians blaming immigrants or foreign powers for domestic problems. Nero's implementation of this tactic would have particularly far-reaching consequences. Nero blamed the Christians. They were a new, mysterious sect at this point, a splinter from Judaism that many Romans found difficult to categorize. Their beliefs and practices remained poorly understood by the mainstream, with rumors of ritual cannibalism, misinterpretations of the Eucharist, and sexual impropriety. The love feast, or agape meal, circulating among the non-Christian population, unpopular for their refusal to participate in traditional religious observances, including emperor worship, viewed with suspicion for their secret meetings and talk of a kingdom not of this world. Their apocalyptic predictions, including references to the world being consumed by fire at the end times, could easily be misconstrued as threats or admissions of arson, easy scapegoats, vulnerable without powerful protectors in the social hierarchy. Persecutions followed, public, brutal, theatrical executions designed to both punish the alleged perpetrators and entertain the masses, combining judicial vengeance with spectacular entertainment in the Roman fashion. According to Tacitus, Christians were wrapped in animal skins and torn apart by dogs, evoking the mythological punishment of Actaeon. They were crucified, a particularly shameful death in Roman culture, reserved primarily for slaves and enemies of the state. Most horrifically, some were set on fire to serve as human torches, illuminating Nero's gardens. During night festivals, their suffering transformed into literal illumination for imperial pleasures, a level of cruelty extreme even by Roman standards, where execution was common but typically not prolonged for entertainment value, except in the formal context of arena events. Did it work? Temporarily, perhaps. The redirected anger may have provided a brief respite for Nero's reputation, but the fire revealed more than just kindling. It showed how fragile the empire could be, despite its marble facades and elaborate administrative systems. How quickly public opinion could turn against even an emperor with constitutional authority and the backing of the Praetorian Guard. How religious minorities could be sacrificed to political expedience, establishing a precedent for state persecution of Christians that would continue sporadically for centuries. How history could smolder under the weight of fear and power, periodically erupting into flames both literal and metaphorical. The fire also led to a massive urban renewal project as Nero seized the opportunity to rebuild sections of the city according to improved planning principles, with wider streets, height restrictions on buildings, and requirements for fire-resistant construction materials. Porticos were added to buildings, providing covered walkways that both enhanced urban aesthetics and created fire breaks between structures. Water supply systems were upgraded, improving both everyday quality of life and emergency firefighting capability. The construction of his massive Domus Aurea, Golden House complex, transformed central Rome, creating an imperial enclave of unprecedented luxury and artistic innovation. These architectural and urban planning changes would influence Roman cities for centuries, demonstrating how disaster could create opportunities for redesign that would be politically impossible under normal conditions, a pattern that would repeat throughout history, from the Great Fire of London to post-war urban reconstruction. For Christians, the Neronian persecution became a formative historical memory, the first state-sponsored violence against their community, enshrined in martyrology and shaping their self-understanding as potentially standing in opposition to imperial power. Traditional accounts hold that both Peter and Paul, foundational apostles, were martyred during this period, though historical evidence remains inconclusive. Whether or not these specific deaths occurred, the persecution certainly claimed numerous victims and established Christians as a distinct group in Roman legal and social consciousness, no longer protected by association with Judaism, which held legal status as an ancient religion. This new visibility came at tremendous cost, but may have paradoxically contributed to Christianity's eventual growth by clarifying its boundaries and creating inspirational martyrdom narratives that demonstrated the faith's power to transcend physical suffering. The fire and Nero's response also reveal important aspects of how information and public opinion functioned in ancient Rome. Despite lacking modern mass media, rumors and popular sentiment could spread rapidly through the urban population, significantly constraining even an emperor's actions. The fire created a crisis of narrative control, with competing explanations circulating that Nero ultimately could not contain despite his extensive powers. This episode demonstrates that ancient rulers, like modern ones, had to manage public perception, not merely issue commands, and that their legitimacy depended in part on maintaining credible accounts of events that absolved them of blame for disasters. The persistence of the fiddling while Rome burned story, despite contemporary evidence against its literal truth, shows how powerful symbolic narratives could become when they captured something essential about how people perceived a ruler's character. Archaeologically, the Great Fire created a distinctive layer in Rome's stratigraphy, a burn level that helps date other findings. Modern excavations continue to reveal evidence of the fire's extent and intensity, with melted metals and collapsed structures testifying to temperatures that exceeded 1,000 degrees Celsius in some locations. The fire thus literally reshaped not only the ancient city, but our modern ability to understand its development, creating a crucial chronological marker in Rome's material record. What was catastrophe for ancient Romans became invaluable data for contemporary archaeologists, an ironic transformation of meaning across millennia. The Great Fire also entered literary tradition, appearing not only in historical works like Tacitus's Annals, but in poetic and rhetorical compositions that used the fire as metaphor for moral and political decay. The image of Rome burning became shorthand for civilizational crisis, for the potential collapse of order and meaning amid spectacular destruction. This literary afterlife extended the fire's significance beyond its immediate physical and political consequences, transforming it into a cultural reference point that could be invoked whenever writers wished to evoke themes of catastrophe, leadership failure, or the vulnerability of even the greatest human achievements to sudden destruction. The Emperor Nero himself became a stock figure representing tyrannical excess, his name invoked by political writers for centuries when criticizing overreaching authority. In the longer historical view, the Great Fire and Neronian persecution represent an inflection point in the relationship between imperial authority and religious minorities that would have profound consequences for Western civilization. The precedent of using Christians as scapegoats would be repeated by subsequent emperors during various crises, creating cycles of persecution that shaped both Christian theology and Roman governance. The fire thus initiated patterns of interaction between state power and religious identity that would continue evolving through the eventual Christianization of the empire under Constantine and beyond, influencing church-state relations throughout medieval and early modern Europe. From this perspective, the smoke that rose from Rome in 64 CE has never fully dissipated. It merely transformed into more abstract questions about religious freedom, state authority, and the rights of minorities that continue to be negotiated in different forms today. Each of these events left a fingerprint on Roman identity. Some are tragic, some are inspiring, all are deeply human. They're not just dates in a textbook or plot points in a documentary. They're moments when people, individuals with hopes and fears not so different from our own, made choices that reverberated through centuries, creating ripples that continue to influence our world today in ways both obvious and subtle. In these stories, we find ambition, fear, hope, betrayal, resilience. We find leaders seeking power and citizens seeking security. We find negotiations between ideals and practicalities, between tradition and innovation, between individual desires and collective needs. The same ingredients that shape our world today, that influence our political systems, our social arrangements, our responses to crisis. These narratives also reveal the complexity of historical change, how seemingly stable systems can collapse quickly when certain tipping points are reached, how individual decisions can sometimes alter the trajectory of entire societies, and conversely, how structural conditions can constrain even the most determined individual actors. They show us both the contingency of history, things could have turned out differently, and its patterns, as certain social and political dynamics recur across different contexts. The significance of these events extends beyond Rome itself. They shaped Western civilization's understanding of governance, law, and civic identity. The assassination of Caesar and the subsequent transformation of the Republic into the Empire has informed political theorizing about the fragility of Republican institutions, from Machiavelli to the American Founding Fathers. The Augustan settlement provided a template for how autocratic power could be reconciled with traditional legal forms that influenced governance systems for centuries. These were not merely Roman events, but world historical moments whose interpretations continue to evolve as each generation brings new questions and perspectives to the ancient evidence. Yet, perhaps most importantly, these stories remind us that history is not an abstract force or an inevitable progression, but the accumulated result of human choices made under particular constraints. Rome wasn't just roads and columns. It wasn't just aqueducts and amphitheaters. It wasn't even just an empire or a republic or a system of governance. It was people living, struggling, dreaming, failing, occasionally transcending their limitations to create something that would outlast them, just like you, just like me, just like every human society before or since. And now that we've wandered gently through time, touching on a few key moments that shaped this remarkable civilization, maybe it's time to let the echoes fade, to return to our own time with perhaps a greater appreciation for both how different the past was, with its communal toilets and limited medical knowledge, its slavery and casual violence, and how similar the underlying human experiences remain. Perhaps we'll carry with us a heightened awareness of our own historical moment, our own place in narratives that may be scrutinized and interpreted centuries from now. Perhaps we'll recognize how our daily discomforts and small triumphs, our political tensions and cultural productions, our technological innovations and environmental challenges all form part of a continuing human story that stretches back to those twin brothers beside the Tiber and beyond, into a shared past that connects us all despite the vast differences in our material circumstances and social arrangements. Sleep well, dear traveler through time. The Roman Empire may be dust, but its stories will still be here when you wake, echoing through our languages, our legal systems, our architectural principles, our calendar, even the very letters with which we write. The past is never truly gone. It lives within us, shaping how we understand ourselves and our world in ways both conscious and unconscious. By exploring these ancient moments, we learn not just about Rome, but about ourselves, our capacities for both cruelty and compassion, destruction and creation, oppression and liberation. In the mirror of history, we see our own faces, looking back, changed yet recognizable across the centuries. Well, you did it. You made it through the Roman Empire, through the myths and the mud, the battles and the bathhouses, the sponge sticks and the porridge, and, perhaps most importantly, you did it from the comfort of your bed. So take a moment, wiggle your toes under the blanket, feel how soft your pillow is. Remember that your walls aren't made of crumbling brick, and that you don't have to share your toilet with 12 strangers and a goat. You, my friend, are living in the future, a time of warm socks and toothpaste, of coffee machines and antibiotics, of Wi-Fi and grocery delivery, and beds that don't smell like wet hay. Sure, life today has its challenges. There's stress and traffic, and that coworker who chews too loudly. But you also have clean water, privacy, and the glorious ability to listen to historical bedtime stories without being arrested for witchcraft. Not bad, right? So next time you think, maybe I was born in the wrong era, just remember, you could have been waking up on a flea infested mattress with no coffee, no rights, and a real chance of being trampled by a chariot on your way to buy half rotten fish. But instead, here you are, safe, cozy, breathing quietly in the dark, maybe already halfway to sleep. History is full of hard lives and strange choices, but it's also full of wonder and the fact that we can look back, learn, and still laugh. That's a kind of luxury the Romans never dreamed of. So rest easy now. Let the marble columns fade into the mist. Let the roar of the Colosseum become a soft murmur in the distance. Let the sandals, the togas, the tunics, and the tyranny slip away. You're home. Sleep well, my friend. And maybe tomorrow night we'll visit another time.
you.